The early August sun had not yet fully warmed Flaxborough when the first visitors of the annual flower show began to drift through the town hall's double doors. The hall itself, as respectable as it was modest, carried a faint scent of beeswax polish and chrysanthemums, a fragrance that might have been charming elsewhere but here seemed merely habitual, like the faintly self-satisfied hum of the town's civic pride. Potted geraniums lined the walls in neat ranks, and a table in the corner displayed prize vegetables, their smooth, waxed surfaces glinting under the harsh overhead lighting. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. Yet within a few minutes, a small but decidedly odd incident was underway. Mrs. Ethel Cartwright, widow and widowish in manner, had been leaning rather precariously over a display of begonias when her hat, a lavender affair with a tendency to slant and flop, caught on the corner of a table. What followed was brief, unremarkable to a casual observer, and yet entirely sufficient to disrupt the measured order of the afternoon. Mrs. Cartwright tumbled backward, knocking over a jug of sweet peas. The flowers fell in a flurry of purple and white, the water soaked the floor, and Mrs. Cartwright herself rose, dignified but indignantly flustered, muttering about the carelessness of younger exhibitors. "It's quite beyond belief," she announced, glancing around for witnesses, her small blue eyes darting as if to assess who would bear the responsibility. The hall, by now, had hushed, its polite murmur replaced by whispers. From the back of the room, a voice piped up. "She's all right, isn't she?" It was Mr. Cyril Broughton, the chairman of the Horticultural Society, who wore a permanent look of mild exasperation that might have been mistaken for worry if one did not know him. "Yes, yes," Mrs. Cartwright reassured him, patting the edge of her hat in an attempt to restore some semblance of authority. "But it is intolerable that a person should simply... Her voice faltered. She waved her hand at the flowers as if the begonias themselves were conspirators. The incident might have ended there, with the hall returning to its mild hum of admiration and competitive squabbling, had not the second peculiarity occurred. Someone, a young boy, possibly attempting to be helpful, screamed. From where she had been standing, Mrs. Cartwright's small handbag had rolled across the floor and come to rest under the table of the town's most renowned florist. Mr. Lawrence Fenn, peering under the table, he retrieved it with a studied care, his expression betraying a curiosity that was hard to disguise. Mrs. Cartwright thanked him with a slightly sharper edge than courtesy might normally warrant, and the boy scuttled back to his mother, eager to disappear into the safer anonymity of small feet and large shoes. Yet for those watching, it was the handbag itself, lying open and absurdly ordinary, that seemed to whisper of something more than a minor accident. A corner of an envelope poked from its depths, and the printed letters of a formal address could be glimpsed. To Mrs. E. Cartwright, 14 Mariners Lane. At this, several eyes widened discreetly. It was, as always in Flaxborough, the contentless content that intrigued most. Inspector Purbright, who had entered quietly while the commotion unfolded, was immediately aware of both incidents. The fall, perfectly plausible, and the handbag, slightly askew but suggestive. Standing with his hands behind his back, as was his habit, he observed the scene with a patience that would have frustrated any who preferred immediate action. His tall, slightly stooped figure seemed a little out of place in the bustling hall, yet there was an unobtrusive authority in the tilt of his head and the careful narrowing of his eyes. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Cartwright," he said in his calm, courteous voice, bending slightly as she inclined her head in a nod of recognition. "I trust you were not too badly shaken." "Shaken? Nonsense," she replied with a huff, though she adjusted her hat with excessive care, perhaps more for show than necessity. "I am always careful, but one must expect carelessness in a town that allows boys to wander where they should not." "Quite so," Purbright murmured. He glanced toward the floor where the begonias had once lain, noting the damp trail the spill had left, and then toward the envelope peeking from the handbag. Nothing about the object screamed criminality, yet the combination of minor disruptions, the hat, the flowers, the envelope, struck him as a pattern the casual observer would miss. Around the hall, gossip was beginning to ferment. Mrs. Gibbons, the widow who ran the bookstall, leaned close to a neighbour. "Did you see? That dear Mrs. Cartwright nearly went headlong into Mr. Fenn's dahlias. I dare say he's never forgiven her for last year's incident with the chrysanthemums." "Oh, indeed," replied her companion. "And what do you make of that letter sticking out of her bag?" "I noticed it before she did. Quite suggestive. I thought. Suggestive, Mrs. Gibbons tutted. It could only be one thing, another one of her admirers, I should think. That is, if she isn't already. Well, you know. Her voice trailed into the polite ambiguity Flaxborough excelled in, leaving her companion to complete the sentence to her own satisfaction. Purbright, listening at the edge of the conversation without intruding, noted the subtle shift in attention. The minor accident had given the town's tongues an excuse to examine Mrs. Cartwright's private life. In Flaxborough, where every shadow of impropriety was magnified and every kindness suspiciously weighed, such opportunities were seized with precision. Mr. Broughton, meanwhile, was directing the younger exhibitors to tidy the tables, his voice taut with irritation. Do be careful, children. One does not want accidents, especially not in the presence of the inspector. His mention of Purbright's name caused several of the younger attendees to straighten, their fingers nervously clutching petals and stems. Purbright made a quiet note of this. Children, he knew, often observed more than adults supposed, and what they noticed might later illuminate truths that seemed invisible in polite company. For the moment, however, he made no move beyond his unobtrusive scrutiny. Instead, he allowed the event to resume its ordinary rhythm, though his mind began the patient work of sifting detail from distraction. In a town as orderly and deceptively serene as Flaxborough, it was rarely the grand disturbances that revealed character. It was the small, quietly improper ones. And in Mrs. Cartwright's fall, the handbag, and the pointedly visible envelope, he suspected a small disorder had begun, one that might yet ripple beyond the flower show's polite confines. And, as always, he would wait and watch and listen, leaving his deductions to unfold at precisely the right moment, in a manner both civil and, for the guilty, mildly disconcerting. By the following morning, the flower show incident had already begun to take on a life of its own. In Flaxborough, news travelled faster than the post, though with a pronounced tendency to accumulate embellishments along the way. Mrs. Cartwright's minor tumble had been transformed, in the telling, into a dramatic, near-fatal plunge. The envelope in her bag had become a mysterious missive of dark and pressing import, and the sweet peas, once simply toppled, were now alleged to have been deliberately sabotaged by a rival exhibitor. Purbright, for his part, read the local paper with a quiet patience that was almost meditative. The Flaxborough Gazette offered a single, breathless paragraph on the flower show, emphasising Mrs. Cartwright's dignity and the heroic retrieval of her handbag by Mr. Fenn. Nothing in print yet suggested a crime, though the subtext was unmistakable. Everyone, it seemed, was waiting for someone to err or confess, or at least for a scandal sufficiently juicy to justify gossip. The inspector made his way, late but unhurried, to Mariners Lane, where Mrs. Cartwright resided in her small, tidy house overlooking the shingle of the seafront. The house itself was neat to the point of severity, each vase and chair in its proper place, each window polished to a clarity that could almost be described as chilly. Mrs. Cartwright greeted him at the door, her hat now a carefully disciplined piece of millinery, and gestured with a faintly imperious nod to the drawing-room. "Do sit," she said, her tone a mixture of courtesy and command. "Though, of course, I expect you've come to speak of yesterday's unfortunate events." "Only to understand them, madam," Purbright replied, taking the offered chair with an easy grace. "It seemed a rather minor accident, yet it has occasioned rather more attention than one might expect." Mrs. Cartwright sighed, settling her hands neatly in her lap. "Flaxborough does have a fondness for drama," she agreed. "One sneeze and the whole town theorises a plague." She gave a faint, ironic smile, but her eyes flickered briefly toward the envelope on the table, now lying in plain sight. Purbright inclined his head toward it. "May I?" he asked politely, indicating the envelope. "By all means," she said, though there was a subtle stiffness in her voice, a hint that its contents were more private than her exterior allowed. He lifted the envelope, noting its neatness, the heavy cream paper, and the precise hand that had addressed it. Nothing about it screamed illegality or threat, yet the combination of minor oddities, the fall, the spilled flowers, the prominently placed envelope, suggested a disturbance that went beyond mere clumsiness. "Is there anyone you were expecting to visit?" Purbright asked, setting the envelope aside for the moment. "Or anyone with particular business with you?" Mrs. Cartwright's gaze flicked to the window for a moment, toward the small bustle of seagulls and the early tides. "Merely acquaintances," she said slowly. "The occasional friend, Letters arrive more often than visitors. I've grown used to the company of words." Purbright nodded. "And these friends? Any quarrels recently? Disagreements over property or family matters?" She shook her head, a touch too firmly. "No, Inspector. Nothing of any significance. I am a woman of peace, as I hope the town knows." He made a note of the firmness with which she delivered the denial, recognising, as he often did, that people of strong propriety sometimes concealed irritation behind careful civility. That irritation, if present, could later manifest in ways both subtle and revealing. The conversation shifted naturally to minor social matters, the upcoming council meeting, the state of the promenade, and the peculiar taste of the town's new bakery. Yet all the while, Purbright observed with the attention of a man who understood that the most telling details were rarely the ones offered voluntarily. The placement of her hands, the slight tension in her shoulders, the intermittent glances toward the envelope, all were noted and catalogued in the quiet method of his mind. Later, as he walked back through the town, the gossip had already begun to take new forms. Mrs. Gibbons and several other widows discussed the flower show with the sort of speculative glee usually reserved for tragedies or weddings. "I hear Mrs. Cartwright was nearly overcome," one said. "And did you notice? Her bag, right there on the floor." One could only imagine what letters it contained. Purbright allowed a polite smile to remain unspoken, aware that townsfolk often believed knowledge was proportional to excitement. The minor incident, magnified, had already begun to reveal character, the anxieties, pretensions, and self-importance of those who observed it. By the afternoon he had visited Mr. Fenn's shop, ostensibly to return a small note found in the hall, though in truth to gauge the florist's recollection of the event. Fenn, a man of careful habits and precise speech, described the retrieval of Mrs. Cartwright's handbag with a mild exasperation that hinted at irritation rather than curiosity. "She is, of course, a delicate soul," he said, "but one would hope she might take more care. The flowers were unharmed, thankfully, though a puddle of water now mars the polished floor." Purbright's eyes, however, lingered on the edge of the table where the handbag had rested. "And the envelope?" he asked lightly. "Did it seem of any consequence?" Fenn considered. "Merely a letter as far as I could tell. But the manner of its fall, well, one might imagine a story behind it, were one inclined to imagine stories." It was this polite, almost reluctant suggestion of a story that caught Purbright's attention. In Flaxborough, the smallest accident could carry unintended significance, and a story, once begun, often gained its own momentum. By evening, the minor incident had already begun to intersect with other elements of the town's quiet life. Mrs. Cartwright was seen walking briskly along the promenade, deliberately avoiding certain neighbours while exchanging faint nods with others. The envelope, now safely stowed in her bureau, remained a silent witness to the day's events. And Purbright, returning to the calm of his office, began the careful process of placing each fragment of observation in order: the fall, the handbag, the envelope, the exaggerated whispers of the town, and the subtle hints revealed in each measured word and glance. He did not yet speak of suspicion, nor would he for some time. Flaxborough, like most places of genteel civility, required patience. But in the quiet of his office he could already feel the outline of a puzzle forming, a pattern of minor disruptions that, when considered together, might suggest something far more deliberate than a slip of a hat or the overzealous placement of flowers. And as always, he would wait. By midweek, Flaxborough had decided upon a narrative. Mrs. Cartwright's mishap at the flower show had been quietly recast in the more dramatic terms that the town favoured. Her fall was now described as startling, the envelope as mysterious, and Mr. Fenn's intervention as heroic. The Gazette printed a follow-up piece under the cautiously vague heading, "Flower Show Incident, Curiosities and Civility," leaving the precise nature of the envelope to the imagination of readers. Within the town, the first obvious suspect emerged not from direct evidence, but from the intersection of petty rivalry and local habit. It was widely whispered that Miss Helena Fairchild, secretary of the Horticultural Society, and known for her sharp tongue and sharper ambition, might have had some motive. After all, she had long resented Mrs. Cartwright's repeated success in floral competitions, and her proximity at the show lent itself, in the eyes of the town, to accidental, or perhaps deliberate interference. Purbright, having received several polite inquiries about the mystery, visited Miss Fairchild at her compact vine-wrapped house near the edge of the park. She met him at the door, erect and precise, as if every corner of her posture were inspected and approved by her own meticulous eye. "I understand you wish to discuss the flower show," she said, ushering him into a drawing room dominated by a glass cabinet of trophies and ribbons. Each gleamed under the subdued light, a testament to her careful diligence. "Merely to understand it," Purbright replied. "The town has, as you may imagine, a lively interest in minor disturbances." Miss Fairchild's lips pressed together, a slight tension that he noted without comment. "Indeed, though it seems to me an overreaction. One misstep, a handbag dropped. I cannot imagine why such trivialities warrant attention." Purbright inclined his head. "It is precisely because they are trivial, Miss Fairchild, that they invite speculation. People tend to overemphasize small events, especially when reputations are involved." She lifted an eyebrow. "Reputations, yes. Mine, for instance." "Your own, among others," he said lightly, allowing the remark to settle. He observed the subtle flicker of irritation that passed briefly across her features, before she masked it with a civil smile. In Flaxborough, such flickers were often more telling than words. The conversation drifted toward the particulars of the flower show. Miss Fairchild described her own involvement with detailed care, enumerating the placement of each exhibit, the condition of the flowers, and her interactions with fellow competitors. All of her statements were precise and consistent, yet Purbright noted with that habitual patience a small but odd detail. She referred twice to a tray of pansies that had been moved at no point by anyone of consequence. The choice of words suggested a subtle dismissal, as if to suggest that minor alterations were irrelevant, yet in context it implied awareness that something had been moved, and her insistence on its lack of consequence drew attention. Returning through the town, Purbright observed how gossip had taken firm root. Mrs. Gibbons, seated outside her bookstall, was now recounting the event as a near tragedy, while Mr. Broughton discussed the moral lessons of carefulness and civic responsibility with anyone who would listen. Flaxborough, he thought, had already begun to arrange the narrative to its satisfaction, weaving minor incidents into a larger story of propriety and misstep. Meanwhile, the envelope remained an unspoken enigma. No one outside Mrs. Cartwright's circle seemed to know its contents, and the widow herself treated it with a guarded civility that only heightened curiosity. Purbright made a note to return to it, though prudence dictated patience. The smallest detail, he knew, often revealed more than a direct interrogation. Later that afternoon, as he strolled along the promenade, he witnessed Mrs. Cartwright herself walking with measured steps. She paused briefly near the small cliff edge, gazing at the grey sea, her expression unreadable. Observing from a distance, Purbright noted the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag. Nothing dramatic occurred, yet the quiet significance of her moment, unremarked by passers-by, suggested an inner life that was far from ordinary. Back in his office, he began compiling the small but accumulating observations, the fall, the handbag, the envelope, the precise accounts of Miss Fairchild, the exaggerated gossip and Mrs. Cartwright's contemplative walks. Each piece seemed minor in isolation, yet together they formed a lattice of human behaviour, ambition, and the subtle interplay of grievance and propriety. Purbright allowed the threads to settle for the evening, leaving them to intertwine in his quiet mind. Flaxborough, in all its gentility, was not a place of overt crime, but of concealed motives, small resentments, and understated rivalries. A slight accident could ripple outward, exposing the undercurrents of character more efficiently than any dramatic theft or violent intrusion. He reflected, as he often did, on the patience required in such cases. The town would provide its own suspects and explanations. His role was merely to observe, gently probe, and wait for the inevitable contradictions to surface. In Flaxborough, human nature tended to reveal itself, provided one had the patience to look and the civility to listen. By the time dust settled, with its cool, briny air and the faint scent of seaweed, Purbright had the beginnings of a map in his mind. Connections between people, minor irritations, and those seemingly inconsequential details that might, in combination, point to a quiet but deliberate disruption. The first obvious suspect, the ambitious Miss Fairchild, had presented a consistent account, but Purbright withheld judgment. In Flaxborough, appearances were only as trustworthy as one allowed, and there was always a possibility that the truth lay elsewhere, quietly concealed beneath civility and decorum. And so, with the town murmuring its own interpretations and the envelope still tucked away, the investigation had begun in earnest, quietly, unobtrusively, and in that calm, civil manner that was the hallmark of Inspector Purbright's patient method. By the following morning, Flaxborough had settled into its usual rhythm, yet a quiet undercurrent of speculation lingered. Purbright, meanwhile, had begun to notice something that might have seemed trivial to an outsider, but, in the measured observation of human behaviour, was curiously revealing. The small detail first caught his eye at the flower show itself, but had only now returned to prominence. The precise manner in which Mrs. Cartwright had placed her handbag on the table, rather than keeping it on her arm as most women did. It was, he realised, a conscious decision, one that might indicate careful attention, or an unspoken expectation. Returning to Mariner's Lane, he decided to observe at a polite distance the routines of the widow. She greeted neighbours with her usual civility, nodded to passers-by, and walked toward the promenade, her steps deliberate. Purbright noticed that the envelope, now safely tucked into the inner pocket of her coat, shifted slightly with each movement, its presence discreet yet insistently tangible. It was the kind of detail that, combined with other small anomalies, suggested a story beneath the surface calm. Later, he visited Mr. Fenn again, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming delivery of autumn bulbs, but in reality to confirm his recollection of the envelope's fall. The florist, precise and courteous, confirmed that nothing about the envelope's appearance had suggested urgency or threat. A simple letter, really, he said, yet its display drew more attention than one might expect. People do enjoy seeing small mysteries. Purbright smiled faintly. Indeed, the town did enjoy small mysteries, but he was interested in why this one seemed to draw Mrs. Cartwright's measured attention. Returning to his office, he set down a notepad, filled with careful observations, and began to trace the minor inconsistencies that had begun to form a pattern. It was at this point that he received a visit from Constable Marples, young and eager, who had been following the gossip with keen interest. "Inspector," the constable began, "some of the neighbours mentioned that Mrs. Cartwright has been unusually attentive to her correspondence. Letters arriving, letters sent, always neatly filed away. One mentioned she was expecting news from a solicitor or some legal matter. Could that be relevant?" Purbright nodded, masking his interest with polite consideration. "It might be, Constable. Keep an eye, discreetly, on anything that seems irregular. Sometimes the smallest hint of concern or expectation tells us more than overt action." In the afternoon, he observed Mrs. Cartwright at a public tea gathering, where the townswomen met to discuss trivialities of fashion and the weather. She was perfectly composed, engaging in polite conversation, yet her hand occasionally touched the inner pocket where the envelope lay. A slip of a smile, a brief hesitation before responding to a question about last year's flower show. It was subtle, but enough for Purbright to note. Later still, he visited Miss Fairchild once more, under the guise of casual inquiry regarding her preparations for the council meeting. Her accounts remained consistent, yet Purbright noticed the way her eyes followed his brief glance toward her own collection of correspondence. A slight tightening of the jaw, a momentary pause before answering a question, small, almost imperceptible, but indicative of awareness of more than she wished to reveal. By evening, Purbright had assembled the day's observations into a coherent sequence. The seemingly trivial detail of the handbag, the envelope, the minor slip at the flower show, and the deliberate composure of both Mrs. Cartwright and Miss Fairchild suggested that there was more to the story than a mere accident or rivalry. It was, in his considered opinion, the manner in which people reacted to small disruptions that spoke volumes. A careful gesture here, a measured hesitation there. Walking back along the promenade as the sun set, painting the sea a muted orange, Purbright allowed himself a moment of reflection. In Flaxborough, minor irregularities often carried disproportionate significance. The town's civility, its carefully maintained routines, and its polished appearances could conceal motives and anxieties that were entirely human, yet entirely revealing to a patient observer. It was clear to him that the next stage of his inquiry would require careful, almost imperceptible testing of these reactions. A word here, a gesture there, might reveal a truth that no amount of questioning could force to the surface. In the calm civility of the town, patience was the key, subtlety the instrument. And so the lattice of observations expanded. Every step Mrs. Cartwright took, every glance she offered, every casual remark from Miss Fairchild or other townsfolk contributed to the slowly emerging outline of what might, if carefully traced, become the truth. In Flaxborough, the real story was rarely in the grand gesture. It was in the deliberate, understated and quietly telling details. Purbright returned home that night with the beginnings of a theory, though he did not yet commit it to certainty. He made careful notes, cross-referenced observations, and left open the possibility that the town's own propensity for exaggeration might be distorting the significance of events. Yet in his mind, he knew that patience would allow these small disturbances to speak for themselves, and that, eventually, the quiet truth would emerge from beneath the polite surface of civility and expectation. The next few days in Flaxborough offered the usual gentle bustle of a small town, though with a discernible tension threaded beneath the civility. Gossip, having been nourished by the flower show incident, now branched into new, if minor, speculations. Mrs. Cartwright's composure remained exemplary, yet it was the subtleties in her behaviour, the precise placement of her handbag, her occasional, almost imperceptible pauses in conversation, that began to attract attention from the more observant townsfolk. Purbright, quietly observing from the edges of town life, noted another small but telling detail. At the town council meeting, he watched Miss Fairchild, seated near the front, respond to discussion of civic repairs with a polite but slightly clipped attention. She consulted her papers meticulously, but every so often her gaze flicked toward Mrs. Cartwright, who sat several rows behind, composed and demure. There was a rhythm to these glances, brief and almost incidental, yet for Purbright they suggested a subtle awareness of the widow's movements and intentions. The town itself contributed additional layers to the developing story. Mr. Cyril Broughton, in his characteristic mild exasperation, mentioned to Purbright that a few complaints had arisen regarding small grievances in the community. Mislaid deliveries, an overheated greenhouse, and a missing gardening tool here and there. Each, in isolation, was trivial. Taken together, they hinted at the small disturbances that Flaxborough's residents, with their eye for order, found particularly irksome. Purbright began to expand his field of observation. He visited the harbour master, who spoke at some length of Mrs. Cartwright's regular walks along the shore, and her habit of watching the incoming tide with quiet contemplation. "She seems quite ordinary," he said, "but there's a certain intensity to her observation. Most people just stroll along. She watches, and I suspect she remembers everything." The inspector noted that this intensity, combined with her composure at the flower show and the subtle attention to the envelope, might indicate more than mere decorum. There was a self-discipline here that suggested she managed both appearance and circumstance carefully, shaping how events and people affected her. Later that day he called on Mr. Lawrence Fenn once more, ostensibly to collect a small invoice, though the true purpose was to gauge reaction to a casually mentioned detail, the trajectory of the handbag as it had fallen. Fenn, polite but precise, confirmed that it had rolled neatly under the table, but had not brushed against anything else. It was almost as if it had been placed with care rather than dropped, he observed with a faint smile, as if sharing an amusing hypothesis rather than an insight of importance. Purbright allowed the remark to settle. The possibility that Mrs. Cartwright had managed subtly the exact path of the handbag could not be ignored. Whether it was conscious or incidental, it added a layer of intrigue to an incident that might otherwise have seemed entirely accidental. By evening, the town had produced yet another layer of nuance, the minor rivalries between those involved in the horticultural society. Miss Fairchild's ambition, Mr. Fenn's quiet competitiveness, and even the modest boastfulness of Mrs. Gibbons at her bookstall all contributed to a lattice of petty grievances and understated envy. Purbright noted that such dynamics often provided fertile ground for misunderstandings and misattributions, and he catalogued each interaction with his characteristic patience. It was during his walk along the promenade under the fading light of the late afternoon that a subtle, almost trivial clue presented itself. A small, neatly folded scrap of paper had been caught in the wind and lodged against a bench where Mrs. Cartwright often sat. It bore a brief, carefully written note: "The tide waits for no one." Evening as before. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, though its purpose remained unclear. Purbright pocketed the paper, noting that it suggested an engagement with some regularity, a meeting or arrangement that was both deliberate and discreet. The instruction, understated as it was, hinted at a methodical approach to something unknown, and the inspector's interest was piqued. In Flaxborough, such apparently trivial communications often concealed more than they revealed, and he filed it carefully among his other observations. Returning home, he reflected on the day's developments. The first obvious suspect, Miss Fairchild, remained consistent and precise, yet her glances, subtle reactions and attentiveness to Mrs. Cartwright suggested that she, too, was aware of something beyond ordinary civic or horticultural concern. Meanwhile, the widow herself demonstrated careful management of her own movements and correspondence, displaying a composure that was almost theatrical in its restraint. The town's social fabric, with its small rivalries, quiet ambitions and habitual civility, was revealing itself in the most delicate of ways. Every glance, every gesture, every minor disruption at the flower show, or in the council chamber, or along the promenade contributed to a slowly emerging map of human behaviour and expectation. Purbright knew that, with patience, these threads would converge, not in a sudden revelation but in a gradual, inescapable clarity, as small truths in Flaxborough always tended to do. As he settled in his office that evening, Purbright catalogued the incidents: the fall, the handbag, the envelope, Miss Fairchild's attentiveness, Mrs. Cartwright's measured walks and notes, the small grievances of the Horticultural Society, and the subtle patterns of gossip that ran through the town. All were minor, almost insignificant in isolation, yet together they formed a lattice of human conduct, one in which intention, anticipation, and propriety interwove in a way that might ultimately reveal the truth. And, as always, he resolved to wait. In Flaxborough, patience was never wasted, and subtlety was the instrument by which understanding could most effectively be achieved. It was on a Tuesday morning, when the tide was low and the gulls quarrelled with each other over the exposed shingle, that Flaxborough experienced what the town would later refer to in whispered tones as the second incident. Mrs. Cartwright's absence was first noted by Mr. Crombie, the postman, who had arrived at her door with a registered letter. She was nowhere to be found, and the envelope, left conspicuously on the hall table, hinted at an intention rather than an accident. By the time Purbright arrived, a small group of townsfolk had gathered near the promenade, murmuring observations that were entirely speculative, yet delivered with the utmost confidence. Some suggested she had gone for a solitary stroll and might have fallen. Others, more imaginative, hinted at an urgent meeting or even a faint scandal. Purbright, keeping his calm and measured manner, moved through the crowd with the ease of a man accustomed to minor frenzies. He made polite inquiries, observing not just the content of what was said, but the manner in which it was delivered. The slight hesitation before a statement, the quickened glance to a neighbour, the tiny flush of self-consciousness. Every nuance was catalogued. At the promenade, Mrs. Cartwright was discovered seated on her usual bench, facing the sea, perfectly composed, as if nothing had interrupted her morning. Her gaze followed the distant line of waves with quiet intent, and when she saw Purbright approach, she lifted a hand in a measured greeting. "Good morning, Inspector," she said, her tone calm yet faintly cautious. "I took a longer walk than usual." "Indeed," Purbright replied, noting the careful attention she paid to the envelope in her lap. "I trust all is well?" "Perfectly," she answered, smoothing the paper with deliberate precision. "One must keep order where one can." It was a simple statement, but Purbright recognised the subtle hint. There was a purpose to her morning, a controlled engagement with circumstance rather than mere leisure. Later, as he reviewed the day's events with Constable Marples, Purbright began to piece together the implications. The deliberate management of the envelope, the measured walks, and the calculated placement of her handbag suggested a quiet orchestration, less a crime than a signal, subtle and civil, yet requiring careful observation to interpret. Returning to the town hall that afternoon, he noticed that the earlier gossip had shifted. Miss Fairchild, who had been the first obvious suspect, now seemed less centrally involved in the minds of townsfolk, though her attentiveness to Mrs. Cartwright remained noted. The focus of curiosity had moved to questions about the envelope and the widow's morning routine. Purbright, with characteristic patience, began to extend his inquiries. He visited Mrs. Gibbons at her bookstall, asking casually about recent letters and local news, listening not so much for information as for the undercurrents of concern and expectation that circulated through the town. Each remark, however trivial, added a layer to the unfolding picture. A reference to a solicitor's visit, a mention of an upcoming council discussion, a hint of a meeting that was expected to occur in private. By the evening, the inspector had assembled a lattice of minor observations, small but significant. The second incident, the prolonged absence and carefully orchestrated presence of Mrs. Cartwright, had shifted the focus from the initial minor disturbance to a pattern of deliberate, understated action. Her behaviour was neither alarming nor obviously suspicious, yet it was sufficiently controlled to suggest intention. Walking along the promenade at dusk, Purbright reflected on the quiet motives that often lay beneath the surface of Flaxborough's civility. The town's residents, for all their gossip and pretence of casual concern, revealed themselves through gestures and omissions, the small discrepancies that only a patient observer could detect. In this instance, the second incident had done more than disrupt routine. It had illuminated the widow's deliberate management of her own circumstances, the subtleties of her communications, and the unspoken interplay with Miss Fairchild and the wider town. Each element, minor on its own, now formed part of a pattern that promised clarity when viewed in aggregate. Purbright resolved to continue his patient observation. In Flaxborough, the story was rarely told in dramatic acts. It was whispered in gestures, hinted at in letters, and revealed through the polite, controlled responses of its inhabitants. The second incident had confirmed this. Nothing overt, nothing violent, yet enough to draw his attention and focus his inquiries on what, in time, would become the central thread of the quiet disturbance. As night fell and the promenade emptied, he returned to his office, his mind arranging the small facts into a lattice of anticipation. Each minor event, the flower show, the handbag, the envelope, the walks, the glances, the measured conversations, would ultimately converge. Patience, as always, was the instrument by which understanding would emerge, and Purbright, with his customary civility and attention, would allow it to do so in its own time. The days following Mrs. Cartwright's seaside excursion were quiet in Flaxborough, yet Purbright sensed a subtle shift in the town's rhythm. The initial buzz of gossip had settled into a cautious, expectant hum. Neighbours passed one another with careful nods. Conversations about the flower show or the envelope were increasingly couched in hypothetical language. People were speaking without speaking, offering suggestions rather than statements, and Purbright observed this with his usual patient curiosity. He spent much of the morning reviewing his notes, allowing the threads of minor observations to coalesce in his mind. The deliberate placement of the handbag, the careful management of the envelope, Miss Fairchild's fleeting glances, Mrs. Cartwright's measured walks, each indicated a level of intentionality that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Yet there was no overt act to condemn, no clear motive, only the gentle accumulation of subtle evidence. By midday, he called on the widow once more, ostensibly to discuss a minor clerical matter relating to the upcoming council meeting. She received him with her customary civility, her hat angled just so, her gloves immaculate, the envelope resting quietly in the inner pocket of her coat. "Inspector," she said, smiling faintly, "I trust your inquiries have not been unduly troubling. One does hope civility is preserved, even amid small disturbances." "On the contrary, Mrs. Cartwright," Purbright replied, seating himself. "It is remarkable how much can be revealed by observing ordinary events. Even minor occurrences offer insight into character." She inclined her head. "Then you have been watching attentively. I do appreciate discretion. It is a rare quality." Their conversation drifted to the mundane, the tide, the upcoming council debates, and the state of the promenade. Yet Purbright's attention lingered on subtler matters. The slight tightening of her fingers when the envelope shifted, the faint hesitation before she answered a question about recent correspondence, the almost imperceptible lift of an eyebrow when Miss Fairchild's name was mentioned. It was in these gestures, not words, that the truth often resided. Later that afternoon, Purbright took a quiet stroll along the promenade, reflecting on the lattice of human behaviour he had observed. The town's civility, he noted, was not merely a matter of etiquette. It was a carefully maintained system of control, a means by which residents managed both their own expectations and those of others. Minor irregularities, misplaced objects, subtle glances, and understated gestures were therefore far more revealing than any overt statement. It was during this walk that he considered Miss Fairchild and her apparent attentiveness to Mrs. Cartwright. The secretary of the Horticultural Society was consistent in her accounts, precise in her explanations, yet her body betrayed a quiet vigilance. The repeated monitoring of Mrs. Cartwright's movements suggested awareness of something the town had yet to discern, or perhaps something she herself sought to influence. Purbright began to formulate what he considered a gentle test. In Flaxborough, subtlety was essential. Overt confrontation risked altering the behaviour of those observed, rendering the truth more elusive. A question asked in passing, a remark dropped casually, a staged observation could elicit the small, telling reactions that were the cornerstone of his method. He arranged, with his habitual patience, to attend a small tea gathering at Mrs. Cartwright's home, under the pretext of discussing minor community matters. Invitations were extended to the usual circle: Miss Fairchild, Mrs. Gibbons, and a few other neighbours whose attentiveness might yield insight. The inspector knew that, in the polite confines of a civil gathering, the carefully controlled responses of those present often revealed far more than direct questioning ever could. As the afternoon progressed, Purbright observed. He noted the precise handling of teacups, the deliberate seating arrangements, the almost imperceptible pauses in conversation when certain topics arose. Each gesture was catalogued, each glance weighed. The lattice of observations began to reveal patterns, subtle rivalries, minor anxieties, and the careful management of appearances. By the time tea was concluded, Purbright had a clearer understanding of the social dynamics at play. The first obvious suspect, Miss Fairchild, though attentive and vigilant, had not acted overtly. Her reactions were entirely consistent with polite interest. Mrs. Cartwright, for all her measured composure, was operating with deliberate control, managing both the envelope and her interactions with a subtle orchestration. Returning home that evening, Purbright reflected on the quiet revelations of the day. In Flaxborough, the truth was rarely immediate or dramatic. It emerged gradually, through the disciplined observation of human behaviour, the subtle interplay of civility and intention, and with patience as always it would come into focus, not in a moment of spectacle, but in the gentle unravelling of carefully managed lives. The next morning, Flaxborough was painted with a cool mist that rolled in from the estuary, lending the town an almost ethereal calm. Purbright, as was his habit, took a slow walk along the promenade, noting with quiet satisfaction the orderly return of routine. Yet beneath that calm he knew the small disturbances of the past week had shifted the pattern of daily life in subtle ways. Glances lingered a fraction longer, conversations were chosen with a touch more care, and the envelope remained an unspoken presence in Mrs. Cartwright's composure. Purbright decided it was time to test the reactions of those involved, not through overt questioning, but by subtle provocation and careful placement of observations. He began at the harbour master's office, where he mentioned casually, as one might in passing, the flower show incident and the subsequent envelope. Curious, he said lightly, how minor accidents often reveal far more about a person than we might initially suspect. The harbour master raised an eyebrow, but said nothing more, allowing the remark to linger. To Purbright, the silence was as informative as a confession. Some individuals could not resist acknowledging implications when framed with civility. Later, he visited the small bookstall where Mrs. Gibbons kept her empire of teas, pamphlets, and local curiosities. "I was reflecting on the flower show," he said conversationally. "A handbag rolling under a table. Trivial, one would think. But it set certain elements in motion, did it not?" Mrs. Gibbons' hands paused mid-arrangement of pamphlets. "Well," she said carefully, "it certainly caused a stir. One never knows what small events may provoke. People do talk, Inspector, as I'm sure you know." "Indeed," Purbright replied, "and those who observe closely might notice things that others overlook. The subtle gestures, perhaps, or the choice of a word." He allowed a brief pause, then nodded politely and departed. The reaction, slight though it was, confirmed his suspicions. The town's attention was focused, not on the apparent accident, but on the interplay of intentions and character. By afternoon, he arranged a casual meeting at Mrs. Cartwright's home under the pretence of reviewing minor community matters. Miss Fairchild attended, along with a handful of other residents whose habitual civility made them suitable observers of one another. The tea was served, and Purbright, with his characteristic restraint, steered conversation toward neutral subjects, while sprinkling subtle remarks that touched on timing, correspondence, and minor discrepancies in the flower show narratives. Miss Fairchild, who had remained composed throughout, now betrayed a fleeting tightening around the mouth when the envelope was mentioned, though she quickly masked it with a polite smile. Another attendee, Mr. Broughton, glanced toward Mrs. Cartwright, as if seeking reassurance, then returned to his cup of tea with a faintly puzzled expression. Purbright noted these small reactions with meticulous attention. The lattice of observations, the carefully placed handbag, the envelope, the precise movements, the measured glances, and now these micro-reactions, was gradually revealing a pattern. Each person's civility was maintained, yet beneath it subtle discomforts and awarenesses surfaced, quietly signalling hidden concerns. As the afternoon waned, Mrs. Cartwright herself demonstrated her quiet orchestration. She allowed the envelope to remain in view, adjusted her seating slightly to accommodate the sun, and engaged in polite conversation that kept the attention off the matter she evidently wished to control. Purbright observed the interplay between her and Miss Fairchild, polite civility underlaid by barely perceptible tension, the management of appearance and expectation executed with quiet precision. By the time he returned to his office that evening, the inspector had compiled a clearer map of the subtle dynamics at play. The second incident, the envelope, the minor gestures, the carefully moderated conversations, all suggested deliberate orchestration, though by whom and for what purpose remained unspoken. Flaxborough, in its understated manner, had provided the clues, and it was now a matter of interpreting them with patience and care. Purbright reflected that evening on the nature of civility and observation. In a town like Flaxborough, human behaviour revealed itself through the subtlest signals, a glance too long, a hesitation too precise, a word chosen with care. The test of reactions had begun to yield results, and with continued patience, the truth, as always, would emerge, not with drama, but in quiet inevitability. The morning brought a pale, almost hesitant sunlight over Flaxborough, casting gentle shadows along the promenade where Purbright often found his thoughts clearest. The town was quiet, its residents immersed in routine, yet the subtle currents of anxiety and expectation persisted just beneath the surface. Each minor interaction, each polite observation, was now more than a mere gesture. It had become a thread in the slowly forming tapestry of understanding. Purbright spent the early hours reviewing his notes, tracing the chain of minor incidents and measured reactions. The handbag, the envelope, Mrs. Cartwright's deliberate walks, Miss Fairchild's attentive glances, all of it hinted at a pattern that had yet to fully emerge. What remained uncertain was the nature of the purpose behind these orchestrated subtleties. He began the day with a visit to the widow herself, under the pretext of discussing an upcoming council meeting. Mrs. Cartwright greeted him with her usual composure, yet Purbright noticed the faintest tension in her posture, a subtle stiffness when the envelope shifted in her inner pocket. She poured tea with an almost ritualistic precision, and every movement was executed with a care that suggested awareness of observation. "Inspector," she said, with the politeness of one who measures every word, "I trust your inquiries have not caused undue inconvenience to our small community. One must always balance curiosity with discretion. Do one not agree?" "Indeed, Mrs. Cartwright," Purbright replied, choosing his words with similar care. "It is remarkable how the smallest occurrences often illuminate character more fully than grand gestures. Even minor disturbances can be revealing." She smiled faintly, not in misunderstanding, but in recognition of the subtle implication. The conversation moved through innocuous subjects: gardening, the changing tides, and local horticultural affairs, but Purbright's mind traced the invisible lattice of behaviour beneath each remark. By late morning, he took a quiet stroll through the lanes adjoining the promenade, observing the town's residents in their habitual routines. Mr. Fenn adjusted his floral displays with meticulous care. Mrs. Gibbons rearranged pamphlets at her bookstall. Miss Fairchild's steps followed a predictable, deliberate pattern. Each act, though mundane, was noted for the slight irregularities, the fraction of a second of hesitation, a glance too long or too brief, a measured inflection that hinted at attention to matters more delicate than outwardly apparent. During this walk, Purbright reflected on the nature of the second incident and its implications. Mrs. Cartwright's measured absence and deliberate presence had shifted the focus from the initial seemingly minor mishap of the flower show to a pattern of purposeful conduct. This conduct was civil, controlled, and entirely non-alarming to the casual observer, yet it spoke volumes to one patient enough to perceive the hidden lattice of interaction. It was in the late afternoon, while sitting on his office veranda, that Purbright began to consider the human motives underlying these carefully choreographed gestures. Civility, he mused, was both a shield and a tool. In Flaxborough, where reputations were tenderly maintained and social expectations rigidly observed, small actions often concealed intentions far greater than they suggested. The envelope, the glances, the subtle gestures, they were all instruments in a silent negotiation of trust, attention, and influence. That evening he reviewed his catalogue of observations. The controlled movement of the handbag, the envelope's deliberate placement, the attentive glances between Mrs. Cartwright and Miss Fairchild, and the quiet ripple of gossip through the town. Each element, when considered alone, appeared trivial. In combination, however, they formed a coherent map of intention and subtle orchestration. Purbright concluded, with his usual restraint, that the next stage would require careful testing of these reactions. A word, a remark, a staged coincidence might provoke responses that would reveal what civility and composure had so far concealed. The town, with its minor rivalries, habitual politeness, and attentiveness to propriety, would reveal its truths to one patient enough to watch, wait, and interpret. As night fell and the town quieted, the inspector remained at his desk, tracing lines between gestures, glances, and events. The lattice was almost complete. What remained was to observe the final, subtle alignment of human behaviour, the moment when intent and civility intersected in a truth that would be undeniable, yet quietly civil. In Flaxborough, revelation would come not in spectacle but in the patient, unhurried convergence of the understated and the deliberate. The following morning, Purbright set out with his usual calm precision, intent on observing the subtle patterns he had been cataloguing for days. Flaxborough, in its habitual rhythm, offered him a living diagram of human behaviour, gestures, pauses, and glances all forming part of the silent language he had come to understand so well. Today, however, his attention was not merely to record but to provoke, a gentle test designed to unsettle and reveal without disruption. He began with a casual call at the promenade, encountering Miss Fairchild as she arranged floral displays for the upcoming society meeting. "I was reflecting," he remarked lightly, "on the incident at the flower show. One might suppose the placement of a handbag trivial, yet it seems even minor events can leave a significant impression on the attentive observer." Miss Fairchild paused mid-adjustment, her fingers lingering over a bloom. Her expression remained polite, but the faintest tightening around the eyes betrayed a subtle unease. "Indeed, Inspector," she said carefully, "people notice more than one might think." Purbright nodded, allowing the remark to linger, then moved on. Each observation was recorded mentally, the interplay of civility and tension revealing as much as direct inquiry ever could. Later, he visited Mrs. Cartwright under the guise of discussing minor council matters. The widow received him with her customary composure, but the envelope, always discreetly in view, seemed more a focal point than ever. Purbright mentioned, in passing, a trivial point regarding the tide schedule, allowing the widow to react naturally. Her measured attention to the comment, and the slight shift in posture when he glanced at the envelope, suggested careful orchestration, yet without overt confession. By afternoon, Purbright arranged another minor gathering, ostensibly to discuss horticultural arrangements, inviting Miss Fairchild, Mrs. Gibbons, and a few other residents. Tea was served, and conversation flowed in the usual polite channels. Yet Purbright, with subtle timing, introduced topics that alluded to earlier incidents. Minor misplacements, the envelope, the widow's seaside walks. As he had anticipated, Miss Fairchild's reactions, though controlled, betrayed a fraction of anticipatory tension, an almost imperceptible tightening of fingers, a glance toward Mrs. Cartwright that lingered slightly longer than civility warranted. The widow herself, maintaining perfect poise, allowed the envelope to remain visible, her composure unbroken yet undeniably deliberate. Purbright allowed the session to continue without interruption, observing the delicate interplay of civility and unease. Each gesture, glance, and minor hesitation formed a pattern, gradually revealing which behaviours were natural and which were carefully managed. By evening, he walked alone along the promenade, reflecting on the day's observations. The lattice of minor incidents, the flower show, the handbag, the envelope, the glances, the measured conversations, was approaching coherence. The subtle orchestration of Mrs. Cartwright's actions, combined with the quiet attentiveness of Miss Fairchild, suggested that a carefully managed sequence had been underway all along. The inspector's reflection extended to the nature of civility itself. In Flaxborough, human behaviour revealed its truths not in drama, but in the quiet alignment of intention, expectation, and observation. The final stage, he knew, would require patience, a moment when subtle provocation and disciplined attention converged, and the concealed orchestration could be calmly revealed. As night fell, Purbright returned to his office, arranging his notes with the deliberate care of a man preparing to complete a complex puzzle. The town's residents would continue their routines, unknowing that their minor gestures, carefully observed, had already revealed the essential truth. All that remained was for the final, polite alignment to occur, a convergence that would expose the quiet orchestration behind the widow's seaside walk and the envelope's significance. The next morning, the tide was high, and the air carried a gentle saltiness, laced with the cries of distant gulls. Flaxborough appeared unchanged, yet Purbright knew that the town's veneer of civility often concealed subtle tremors of understanding. Today, he would draw together the threads he had been observing for weeks, allowing the quiet orchestration of behaviour to emerge in full. He arrived at Mrs. Cartwright's residence with his customary calm, finding her seated by the window, the envelope neatly placed before her on the polished table. Miss Fairchild was already present, arranging flowers with meticulous care. The other attendees of recent minor gatherings had been invited under pretext of a brief council discussion. The setting, ordinary in appearance, was designed to prompt subtle revelations. "Good morning, Inspector," said Mrs. Cartwright, her voice serene. "I trust the day finds you well." "Indeed, Mrs. Cartwright," Purbright replied, settling into his chair. "I hope we may take a few moments to consider the minor peculiarities that have been occupying the town's attention." He allowed a deliberate pause, glancing casually at the envelope. Miss Fairchild's fingers twitched almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Cartwright's gaze remained calm, yet there was a slight adjustment of her hands, a graceful repositioning that spoke of measured control. "As we have observed," Purbright continued, "it is remarkable how small events, the placement of a handbag, the careful management of correspondence, can ripple through a community. It is equally remarkable how civility and attentiveness shape both perception and expectation." He leaned forward, lightly tapping the envelope. "This simple item has caused much speculation, yet its significance has never been in the paper itself, but in the manner of its handling, the attentions it commanded, and the interactions it provoked." Miss Fairchild's composure wavered for a heartbeat, her careful attentiveness revealing more than words ever could. Purbright's gaze shifted gently to Mrs. Cartwright. "It is, in truth, a demonstration of subtle orchestration, isn't it? Not a crime in the ordinary sense, but a quietly executed display of influence and foresight." Mrs. Cartwright inclined her head ever so slightly, acknowledging the inspector's insight. "Inspector, one must maintain order where one can," she said, her tone serene, precise, and entirely civil. "Even minor matters require attention to timing, intention, and consequence." Purbright allowed the moment to settle. "And the minor disturbances, the flower show, the envelope, the seaside walk, have all served to reveal, not conceal, the interplay of human observation, care, and civility." He smiled faintly. "In Flaxborough, we discover much through what is quietly managed rather than through overt acts. The town, its residents, and these small events have all, without disruption, spoken the truth." A gentle hush filled the room. Miss Fairchild relaxed, the subtle tension lifting, and the others absorbed the clarity of Purbright's explanation with polite nods. The widow herself remained composed, the quiet control of her actions and the subtle communication of intent acknowledged and understood. "Thus," Purbright concluded, rising slowly, "we see that the so-called incidents were not accidents nor misdeeds, but demonstrations of deliberate human behaviour, of care, attention, and discretion. The truth, in Flaxborough, is rarely spectacular. It emerges gradually, quietly, and politely." The group acknowledged his words with civility, and for the first time in weeks, the minor tension that had threaded through the town's interactions seemed to dissipate. The envelope, the glances, the seaside walks, all had been part of a careful choreography, revealing human intention in the softest of gestures. Purbright allowed himself a small, private satisfaction. The lattice of observation, patient attention, and subtle provocation had yielded understanding, without a single breach of decorum or civility. As he departed, the town continued its routines. Shops opened, the promenade saw its gentle walkers, and the gulls quarrelled lightly over the shingle. Yet beneath the calm, a faint awareness lingered among the residents, that minor actions, observed patiently and interpreted with care, held more truth than any overt spectacle could reveal. Purbright returned to his office, resuming the quiet work of reports and correspondence, content in the knowledge that the intricate lattice of human behaviour had been quietly, civilly and completely understood.